The problem with responding to Thunderfoot's video defending the UK remaining in the EU is that it is so badly organized. He makes 5 main points and a series of minor things, but they're scattered throughout the video. So I'm going to respond to each of the 5 points instead of going through his video strictly chronologically. And those 5 points are: 1, the point that CERN, talking about CERN and saying that small countries don't count, don't analogize to the UK and traveling abroad issues. 2, trade problems. 3, leaving the EU is in a very roundabout way would lead to the old Europe, which would lead to war. Immigration issues in the Schengen area. And 5, the UK stinks, so stay in the EU. So let's get into this video.
Nonetheless, in the event of a Brexit, me, as a scientist who's worked in the US, the UK, Germany, France and the Czech Republic, would now need, just like, say, for instance, the Polish plumbers, would need a visa or similar to go work in Europe. It would be a royal pain in the arse. It's a barrier to trade. And I don't even know how this would affect some of the European-funded nuclear reactors at which I do most of my research.
Well, we can take a look at CERN's funding by country, and we can see that Norway, despite not being in the EU, funds and participates in CERN. So does Israel. In addition, the UK is not in the Schengen area. Now, I don't know what particular special agreement the UK has with the EU in terms of passport requirements. It's probably not exactly the same as just any other country. But you, Mr. Thunderfoot, you seem to be able to get around EU countries just fine, despite not being in a Schengen area country. In addition, Norway, which is not a member of the EU, is a member of the Schengen area. So the idea that you have to be a member of the EU to have, free travel through those countries seems not true.
Now, naturally, if this was some smaller bit player, like, say, for instance, Norway, then you could probably make something like the Brexit work, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. I mean, hell, more people live in London than in Norway. But this is Britain talking about leaving the EU, one of the largest pieces. Damn straight, that's going to destabilize things.
Right. London is a big part of Britain, a very big part of Britain. So let's compare the whole population of each country, which seems the most obvious thing to do. Saying London has more people than Norway seems more like a persuasion tactic than a meaningful argument here. So the UK has around 12.4 times as many people as Norway. Is that so much bigger that the rules don't apply for a quote-unquote small country like Norway? How high does their population have to be before Norway is a big country and then the rules apply to them? Does it have to be as big as Sweden, as big as Poland, as big as Romania, as big as Spain? When does it become a big country? Or maybe GDP is what's more important. On that, the UK is only 7.3 times the GDP of Norway. Is that so much bigger that the rules don't apply to Norway and Norway can just sort of be hand-waved away?
And then, of course, what about the Brits who bought their cheap retirement homes in Spain? Again, where previously there was stability, there will be uncertainty.
Right, and there are Norwegians living in Spain just fine while being part of the Schengen area but not an EU member. And there are British people who are not part of the Schengen area, but are formal EU members, who also live abroad just fine. And there are people in the United States who are part of neither the Schengen area or the EU, who live abroad in places like Spain just fine.
After all, to a very real extent, Britain can't leave. Britain, England, Great Britain, whatever, doesn't matter, is a set of islands off the coast of Europe, and geographically, it's not going anywhere. The majority of the trade will still be done with the European Union. This is why people like Obama were against Britain leaving.
Well, this is actually not true. The majority of Britain's trade is now done with non-EU countries, and it seems to be trending more and more that way. So, to that point. Also, the United States has a higher trade volume with the EU countries than the UK does. And it does so while not being an EU member, and and being a big country. So they are both. The U.S. is a big. I mean, if Britain's a big country, then the U.S. is a big country. It does more trade with the EU, and it does it without being, an EU member. So it's able to do that. Thunderfoot then goes on to say that the UK would have to renegotiate trade deals with each and every country on the planet, and that would be an expensive, disruptive nightmare. Now, that's a really stupid way to go about it. Another way would be to maintain all existing trade agreements entered into as a starting point, and then, since the UK is no longer part of the EU, and then having the option to then modify these existing treaties, since they are now no longer legally bound strictly to whatever it is the EU is saying that the UK has to do for its trade. And, Thunderfoot loves free trade. Okay, I'm not going to argue about that here. I have opinions on that. But Norway, Switzerland, South Africa, and South Korea, they all have free trade agreements with the EU. So, even and they all have access to the EU free trading bloc, and they're part of the EU free trading bloc while not being part of the EU. Why couldn't Britain just do that? I mean, that may not be entirely Thunderfoot's criticisms regarding the EU, but if it's just trade, if Thunderfoot is just concerned about trade and he's a big free trader, then all right, well then the UK can just follow the model of Norway, Switzerland, South Africa, and South Korea. Now, is South Korea a small country? Anyway. In addition, the European Union apparently has not done a good job of securing free trade deals with the United States, with China, and with India. And it's possible that the UK could do a better job than the EU at negotiating deals unilaterally. Certainly there's a plausible story you can tell. Certainly it would be less complicated for the UK to negotiate those treaties, since they would be negotiating just for Britain as opposed to having to negotiate for the entirety of Europe.
I mean, America had a similar sort of deal with this sort of thing when the South decided it wanted to leave. It was going to secede and keep its slaves, which is what, of course, led to the Civil War. A war which killed more Americans than any other in history. Just because they hated the English. I mean, sure, the Scots hate the English and the English hate the French and so forth. Indeed, you get jokes in France like, don't you hate the Germans? To which the answer is, of course, no, we're only at war with Germany for 6 or so years. The unspoken punchline being we've been at war with England for most of the last 1,000 years. But as with many things, many a true word spoken, or in this case, not spoken, in jest. The natural state of Europe is war. My shelves are replete with a technological symphony of weapons of war made by Europeans to kill each other. I mean, just to put this into perspective, World War II alone, England and America dropped 1.5 megatons of bombs on Germany. 1.5 million tons of bombs on Germany. And that's just what they did with the planes. And I'm going to go to Germany next week and give a talk. Both of my parents experienced first-hand bombing in World War II. Indeed, it was my dad's earliest memory. Anyway, over the last 70 or so years of peace, Europe has flourished. It has become much more technologically advanced. The living standards have skyrocketed. But it's also become much more fragile. In the past few weeks, there has been a blockade of some refineries in France, which have just showed how quickly a modern first world country can be brought to its knees by a handful of disgruntled truckers. Same thing happened in England about a decade or so ago, and with an infrastructure this fragile, in a shooting war, you're not looking at months for things to go to pieces, you're looking at days. England, however, is far more strategically vulnerable. It always has been. Without imports, England can support a population of maybe 20 million, and that's forgetting your widescreen TV, that's living the agrarian life. Historically, this is why Britain had to rule the waves, because if it didn't, a naval blockade of the country could bring about its defeat.
Yeah, hey, Thunderfoot, this is fucking stupid. This is a joke. Yes, apparently the reason militarist movements are not on the rise in Germany and in France and Italy is because those countries are in the European Union. I mean, look at how Japan, without being in the EU, they just lapsed right back into militarism, right? No, this is just vague and weird kind of fear-mongering of a really pedestrian sort. It's really quite lowbrow and quite surprising that Thunderfoot would talk about stuff like this. Anyway, then Thunderfoot goes on and he talks about immigration.
However, a lot of people are worried about immigration. And yeah, I share your concerns. It's not so much the people, but some of the ideas and cultures that they bring. But then again, England already has border controls, unless you're going to impose some sort of visa requirements on the entire of Europe, which would be kind of pointless unless you've got a competent intelligence service that can successfully screen out all of the problems. And what would be the point anyway? Great Britain is arguably already a European hotspot for this sort of thing. And indeed, arguably it should be Europe who's imposing visa restrictions on the UK to stop it exporting this sort of thing. Apart from they can't, because of the rules that were already negotiated with the EU.
This is actually a good point. The UK is full of blacks and Muslims, and so leaving the EU would better quarantine these blacks and Muslims from getting into other European countries. So that is another good reason to support the Brexit.
I mean, practically, of course, it's mostly a waste of time. The whole point that we relaxed the borders in the first place was to allow free trade to work better in Europe.
Now, that's the problem, though. Say France decides to import a bunch of blacks from their African colonies, for example. They say, these are the African French. We have a tree of France. We have the Arab French, the African French, the Chinese, right? And let's say they do that. Well, if you're in the Schengen area, or have some other agreement that relaxes migration with the EU area, these Africans are now, in the eyes of the state, quote-unquote, French citizens. And they're not just France's problem anymore. They're your problem now. And that's really why everybody should leave the EU. Because if one country has lax border controls, all countries have lax border controls. And while the UK may be more racially paused than the rest of Europe, it's also still wealthier than, for example, Spain. And if a bunch of Africans get into Spain, they're going to want to get into Germany, but also they're going to want to get into Britain, because Britain has money too. And the EU definitely wants the UK to start taking these people, simply because a bunch of Africans went up through the Sahara, up through Morocco, and got into Spanish Morocco, and now they're Britain's problem, right? And remaining in the EU, becoming more entwined and integrated with EU law, is only going to give the EU more and more leverage over the UK to do all sorts of nasty things. The chief concern being that they demand to accept large numbers of blacks and Arabs into their country. And the fact that the UK is more, racially paused than the rest of Europe, or that the UK has a higher population density than Holland, that is not going to matter one bit to Brussels. Okay. And the next thing Thunderfoot talks about is how the UK government is kind of a farce, which is why it should stay in the EU.
Now, this really isn't about whether Europe is a farce or whether Britain's politics are a farce. It's about what's the best option on the table for Great Britain. For me, it's a simple costs-benefits analysis. What are the costs and what are the benefits? Now, don't get me wrong. I could create an absolute devil's sermon on the inefficiencies of the European Union and how the path to hell can truly be lined with the best bureaucratic intentions. Oh, thank you, Europe. Now I need a screwdriver to change the bloody battery pack. But then again, Britain's political system is pretty farcical itself. Sadly, he died of cancer recently, and that was mostly thanks to the NHS and the UK's cancer survival rates being some of the lowest in Europe. And yeah, I did some interviews with my dad before he died and how he felt about this. And oddly, he predicted exactly the incompetence that actually killed him. Yeah, There's a lot of bureaucratic inefficiency to worry about in Europe. But there's also a hell of a lot of putting your own house in order before you get too vocal about how terrible it is for the TV license costs of the inefficiencies of Europe. Well, okay, let's say there are 75 million Brits. That means that the average Brit pays about £2 a week, or £100 per year. That means that Europe costs your average Brit about as much as a TV license.
Now, first off, I don't see how this relates to the EU. The UK has shitty government, therefore add another layer of government to fix it. But more importantly, at one point he talks about he can give a devil's sermon about how bad the EU is, but then says the only cost of the EU is £100 per year per person. So that's a pretty obvious contradiction there. How much, for example, do you think the common agricultural policy cost? That's one of the things that Thunderfoot flashed in front of the screen. How much did that cost? Is that only £100 a person a year? I'm not the person to tell you what the real cost of the EU is to Britain. I'm sure there are a ton of people who can give you line and verse on that. I'm just pointing out how bad Thunderfoot's arguments are. And then at the end, with no sense of irony, right, Thunderfoot, the guy who invoked World War III as an argument to stay in the EU, accuses people wanting to vote against the EU purely based on a feeling.
For what tangible gain? If you're just voting exit because it feels good, I understand your protest vote. But in practice, it's just going to be a very costly change for Britain to something that is more or less exactly the same as it was in the first place. I mean, remember how I started this video, with Scotland voting to leave. How did that make you feel? That the Scottish, on the grand scale of things, a bit player, were about to break up the United Kingdom. I mean, in many ways, the mere fact that you're having this referendum, just like with Scotland, kind of undermines the very essence of the whole concept of, say, a United Kingdom. Voting to leave Europe, voting to leave your seat at the table, just kind of splits the very concept of a united Europe.
What a bizarre series of statements. First off, not everyone wants a united Europe, or a united kingdom. Second off, Britain can unite with Europe on its own terms. Third off, why is now being part of the EU the only way to be united with Europe, if that's what you want? This video was a very surprising one by Thunderfoot. I did not expect his arguments to be so bad. When I saw Thunderfoot making arguments to stay in the EU, I thought this was going to be a giant pain in the ass because Thunderfoot has a high IQ, and high IQ people can defend literally anything and be a real pain. But this didn't happen, and it's just kind of weird that I'd see a video like this coming from Thunderfoot. From just outright and very simply shown falsehoods on trade and on scientific research, and this really silly argument that small countries don't count as analogies. And lastly, let's say Thunderfoot is right, and that there are some short-term costs to leaving the EU. I'm skeptical of even those, but whatever, say that's real. Well then, the question should be, is that worth being independent of the EU? Is that short-term pain worth the freedom from whatever craziness the EU is going to do in the future? Because the EU is no longer just a free trade zone, it is an administrative pseudo-state. And that is why people are voting against it.